One Egyptian myth recounts how Ra, the sun god, once ruled as a king over Egypt, but he discovers one day that people are conspiring against his rule, and infuriated, Ra decides to destroy his enemies, and he sends out his fiery eye. His eye becomes Sekhmet, which literally means, by the way, the powerful one. And Sekhmet goes on a rampage and creates one bloodbath after another. At which point Ra relents and wants to undo his decision, but he can't stop the goddess until it's decided that the only way to save humankind from total destruction is to render her drunk through a ruse. And the high priest of Ra and his helpers create fake blood, mingling beer with red ochre, which is spread over the land and is then lapped up by Sekhmet on the assumption that this is blood, and of course she's rendered drunk. And as a consequence, she returns in peace back to Ra, and humankind has been saved. The ancient Egyptian pantheon of deities is virtually endless. There were many gods and goddesses that were only worshipped very locally, and we cannot, pin an exact figure to how many gods there were. It depends really on where you were in the country. Each region and each city had their own mini pantheon of gods that were particularly important to the locals. Some of these deities would not even be worshipped elsewhere in the country. And yeah, these were the gods that you would turn to in your prayers for protection and favors. There were, of course, some more major deities that were worshipped all over the place eventually, and that became more incorporated at a local level in all kinds of provincial temples, where they acquired strictly local additional attributes. And there was also a tendency over time for Egyptian deities to become more and more conflated, to be regarded as aspects of each other. And this was very much shaped also by politics, for example, where a royal dynasty might originate from. An example of this is the god Amun, god of air and wind, originally very obscure provincial god. But his cult center was in Thebes, and when a new line of kings took control of Egypt that originated from Thebes, suddenly the cult of Amun was brought to greater prominence, and he was basically attached to the sun god Ra that I already mentioned, and became Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra is basically Amun as Ra and Ra as Amun. But yeah, so there were major cults that took root all over the country. But one thing to realize is that these great temples were not accessible to the general public beyond the forecourts, basically. The inner sanctums where the cult statues were kept could only be visited by the king and the priests who ran the daily cults on his behalf. Ordinary people, common folk, would not be able to approach the god this closely, and they would basically have to direct their prayers mainly at the royal statues that guarded the entrances to these temples. There were colossal statues of kings that would receive these prayers. The king would be spiritually present in these statues and then pass these prayers from common folk to his fathers residing in the interior of the temple. So the king was a mediator between ordinary mortals and his fathers, the gods. The only real opportunity for people to come quite close to the gods was when their cult statues were carried out of the temple during festive processions, processional feasts. So over 3,000 years of pharaonic history, it's really 3 millennia of pharaohs ruling over Egypt. Egypt exerted a lot of influence on neighboring cultures, and that includes, of course, in its artistic expression, architecture. For example, even pyramid building was exported. Egypt's southern neighbor, the kingdom of Kush, in present-day Nubia, northern Sudan. Kings of Kush ultimately built more pyramids than the pharaohs of Egypt ever did. Egyptian artists were also employed by foreign rulers, by not just the Kushite rulers, but also, for example, the kings of Byblos on the Mediterranean coast in present-day Lebanon, or the rulers of the Achaemenid Empire. And artists of other cultures also willfully imitated Egyptian art. For example, especially from the 8th century BC, you see how Phoenician artists and archaic Greek artists are adopting all kinds of iconographic motifs from Egyptian art. Also the canon of proportions that Egyptian artists adhered to in representing the human body. And of course, the Greeks, in their turn, would pass these influences onwards to Etruscans and Romans.